On November 10, 2008, a Ryanair Boeing 737 carrying 172 passengers and crew flew through a large flock of birds on final approach to Rome Ciampino Airport in Italy. The crew tried to go around, but lost control when both engines stalled. The aircraft crash-landed halfway down the runway, causing substantial damage and injuring a number of passengers. Why did the captain decide to go around? Was the forced landing necessary? And what can be done to prevent similar incidents in the future? Stay tuned to find out. Ryanair Flight 4102 departed Frankfurt, Germany in the early morning of November 10, 2008. Its destination was Rome Ciampino Airport in Italy, a 1-hour, 50-minute trip. The aircraft was an 8-month-old Boeing 737-800, a modern aircraft with an excellent safety record. Ryanair had a vast fleet of 737s at the time and had flown them without serious incident for nearly a decade. The flight is operated by a crew of 2. The captain, a 44-year-old Belgian citizen, was highly experienced with almost 10,000 hours of flying experience, 6,000 of which were on the 737. The first officer on this flight was far less experienced. He was a 23-year-old Dutch citizen who had been employed by Ryanair for just 6 months at the time. He'd accumulated just 600 hours of flight experience, 400 of which were on the 737. After a completely routine flight south, the pilots began their descent into Rome Ciampino at 7:20 a.m. local time. The first officer briefed the captain on the approach in line with company procedures. The captain commented on the weather conditions, which were ideal for flying, and the first officer confidently stated the go-around procedure. As the crew descended through 17,000 feet, the captain, aware that the first officer was a new pilot, offered him the chance to fly the aircraft by hand for the rest of the flight. The captain considered it important that new pilots get practice at manual flying. Everything went smoothly as the aircraft lined up with the runway for final approach. The tower cleared the aircraft to land and advised the pilots that the wind was calm and the skies were clear. During final approach, the captain prompted the first officer to make some minor corrections to his approach path. The captain continued providing feedback to the first officer during final approach, ensuring that the parameters for a stable approach were maintained. When the computer-generated voice of the aircraft declared minimums, indicating that the decision to land or go around must now be made, both captain and first officer stated that they were going ahead with the landing. Now we'll let the accident unfold, and we'll come back to it and examine it step by step in a moment. Seconds before landing, the captain noticed a flock of birds in front of the aircraft. The first officer would later describe the flock as like a black cloud that came from below. At just over 100 feet above the ground, and just as the aircraft was about to cross the runway threshold, the captain ordered a go-around, and the takeoff go-around, TOGA, mode was activated on the engines. The throttles were pushed fully forwards, and the flaps were raised from 40 degrees to 10 degrees. There was no avoiding the birds, however, and at exactly the same time that full thrust was applied, the aircraft collided with the birds just over the runway. However, the engines, instead of producing the necessary thrust to go around, started slowing down. As a result, the aircraft was not able to climb. This led the pilots to disregard the rest of the go-around checklist, which involved raising the landing gear. Instead, the captain promptly took control of the aircraft and turned all of his attention to looking outside in order to bring the plane to the safest possible touchdown on the runway. The captain held the nose of the plane up, but the aircraft was going too slow and it stalled and fell rapidly towards the runway below. The aircraft impacted about halfway down the runway at 120 knots, descending at about 1,000 feet per minute. The first part of the aircraft to hit the ground was the rear fuselage and the main left landing gear. Then the right main landing gear made contact. The left-hand landing gear then collapsed, and the left engine made contact with the runway. The pilots used the brakes, spoilers, and left engine thrust to slow the plane during the ground roll. The aircraft came to a stop just 50 meters from the end of the runway. Less than 15 seconds later, the pilots shut off the E. The passengers were evacuated with a small number of them suffering minor injuries. The aircraft was substantially damaged and was written off. These pictures, taken shortly afterwards, showed the severity of the crash. An investigation was launched immediately after the crash, headed by Italy's Civil Aviation Safety Investigation Authority. Examination of the aircraft after the crash landing and interviews with the pilots immediately revealed, to no one's surprise, the main cause of the accident as being impact with a dense flock of birds on final approach. A total of 86 impacts were counted. However, a question remained as to whether the outcome needed to be as bad as it had been. The investigators discovered that the bird strike occurred just 7 or 8 seconds before the plane would have touched down. In this situation, no matter what the damage to the aircraft, they determined that it would have been safer to continue with the landing. They discovered that most of the damage to the engines was in fact caused by the increase in thrust at the moment of the bird strike, which was a result of the pilots trying to go around. They determined that if the pilots had continued with their approach, the damage to the engines would likely have been confined to the fan blades at the front of the engine and would not have extended to the engine's core. This would have enabled the aircraft to land safely and in a relatively normal manner. The reason this crash was so forceful and destructive was that the pilots had initiated a go-around, and, in doing so, further damaged the engines by the use of a high-power setting, which caused them to stop producing thrust, which slowed the plane to the point of an aerodynamic stall, causing it to come crashing down at the halfway point of the runway. The main question in the minds of investigators was, why did the captain decide to go around? The plane, after all, was mere seconds from touchdown when it hit the birds. During interviews with investigators, the captain gave a number of reasons that he considered a go-around to be the safest option. First, he mentioned that the aircraft was heavy at over 61 tons, which would increase the stopping distance required on the runway. On top of this, damage caused to the undercarriage and brakes by the birds may have further increased the stopping distance. Finally, they had a tailwind, and the runway at Ciampino was shorter than most runways used by the 737. All of these factors meant that there was an increased risk of overshooting the runway if the crew had continued the approach. A go-around would give them time to assess the situation, the captain said, and perhaps make an approach to somewhere with a longer runway, like Fiumicino Airport, which the captain knew was close by. Above all, the captain said that the safety of the landing was in doubt at the moment of the bird strike, and that, quote, as we were taught at the time, in case of doubt, go around. We were trained for that. A number of pieces of evidence point to what's known as the startle effect as being the cause of the captain's actions. First, when he saw the birds, he shouted 10 times in quick succession. This, as you can imagine, is not a standard call-out. Second, when the go-around maneuver was initiated, the captain moved the flaps from 40 degrees, the landing setting, to 10 degrees instead of the usual 15 degrees used for a go-around. During interviews with the captain, investigators found that he did not intend to select 10 degrees flaps and was not aware of having made this selection. This is consistent with an instinctive reaction to an unexpected situation, namely seeing a dense flock of birds in front of you, which is typical of the startle effect. In the official report on the accident, investigators attributed this response to the fact that the flight crew had received no training on what to do if they experienced a bird strike on landing. They also concluded that the lack of training on how to deal with the startle effect in critical phases of flight also contributed to this accident. Following this incident, Boeing introduced a section on bird strikes in the 737 pilot training manual. Here's an excerpt from that section entitled True Actions for a Bird Strike During Approach or Landing. If the landing is assured, continuing the approach to landing is the preferred option. If more birds are encountered, fly through the bird flock and land. Maintain as low a thrust setting as possible. If engine ingestion is suspected, limit reverse thrust on landing to the amount needed to stop on the runway. Ryanair also made some changes to their simulator training in response to this accident, and in response to similar low-altitude accidents at the time, like the British Airways 777 on short final at London Heathrow in 2008 and US Airways Flight 1549's ditching in the Hudson River that year. 3 simulated scenarios were included in this training, and to replicate real-world conditions and maximize the startle effect, pilots were given minimal briefing of the events beforehand. The scenarios were as follows. A bird strike at 700 feet on final approach leading to a double engine failure. A bird strike on departure passing 6,000 feet, allowing a turn back to the airport for a glide approach. A bird strike passing 3,000 feet on departure, necessitating a ditching in the sea. The final report into this accident recommended that pilots be provided guidelines and training procedures on how to deal with bird strikes on final approach. It recommended that the following topics are covered in the guidelines. To discuss bird strike risks during takeoff and approach briefings when operating at airports with known or expected bird activity. In case of a single or multiple bird strikes in the final approach phase, if landing is assured, it is preferable to land maintaining the lowest possible engine power setting rather than carrying out a go-around procedure. And finally, to consider that engine damage or malfunction might prevent the go-around maneuver from being completed safely, making it impossible to land on the runway if a go-around is initiated. The report also recommended that specific training be given to pilots to help them cope with the startle effect, particularly in critical phases of flight, such as approach and landing. If you enjoyed this episode, please like, subscribe. Each week I release a new video covering an aviation accident or incident. A general overview of this event can be found in the description box below the video along with the credits for the episode.ins.